Margaret Marks had been sitting by her room's door for 3 hours, listening intently. She desperately wanted to go to the kitchen. She was hungry, but she couldn't. Her daughter-in-law had occupied the kitchen all this time. First she prepared breakfast, then fed her daughter and husband, Mrs. Marks's son. Now she was just sitting there, probably drinking coffee, eating sandwiches and watching TV. Mrs. Marks could hear one programme ending and another beginning. Pamela remained in the kitchen, as if she couldn't watch TV in the living room. Mrs. Marks understood her daughter-in-law's behaviour. It was to show her who was in charge. Absurdly, but the elderly woman could barely leave her tiny room without permission in her own house. Everything about Mrs. Marks irritated her daughter-in-law. How she walked, talked, even breathed. Recently, she told Bradley that her mother was driving her crazy. She drops crumbs when she eats, sometimes breaks dishes because her hands are hooked, as she put it, and she's always moaning and sniffling like a hippopotamus. Pamela said all this loudly, ensuring her mother-in-law could hear. "Tell your mother to stay out of my sight," Pamela shouted. "You know she's tormenting me on purpose, and I'm pregnant. I can't be stressed." Bradley mumbled something, and Pamela continued her demands. "When I'm in the kitchen, don't let her come in. She should eat in her room. Tell her to use the bathroom when I'm not at home. And I want her to be neater. I'm sick of cleaning up after her, and let her dry her clothes in her room. She's covered the whole yard. It's embarrassing to go outside because of her clothes hanging around." Mrs. Marks listened to all this, fighting back tears. How could it be? To hear Pamela, she was careless and untidy. But that wasn't true. Mrs. Marks had always been neat. It was just that age was taking its toll. Indeed, sometimes at dinner she might drop food, and crumbs would escape her toothless mouth. At such times her daughter-in-law would grimace and swear. Her 15-year-old daughter Chloe also showed her displeasure. Mrs. Marks realised the sight was probably unpleasant, so she tried her best to please her new daughter-in-law, eager to wash dishes or cook something. But again, everything was wrong. In Pamela's opinion, the old woman washed dishes poorly, leaving food stuck to forks and stains on plates. Sometimes a cup or plate would slip from the old woman's hands, shattering on the floor. Pamela would explode, screaming that Mrs. Marks was useless. When the elderly woman reached for the broom, Pamela angrily snatched it away. "I'll clean it myself," the daughter-in-law almost growled. "You're hopeless. You'll only spread the shards around. Go to your room and stay there." At first, Mrs. Marks thought her daughter-in-law was speaking in a spark of anger. and would forget about it. Then she realised Pamela had made up her mind. One day, her son came to the elderly lady and, avoiding eye contact, said it would be better if she left her room only in emergencies. "Stay there, have your knitting and books, sleep more," said Bradley. "We'll bring food to your room." "How can this be, my son?" Mrs. Marks gasped. "I can't even take a step in my own house. It's inhumane." "Don't be dramatic," Bradley dismissed her. "You can see Pamela is having a hard time, so don't upset her. If you don't want to eat in your room, go to the kitchen when she's not there, and do your laundry when Pamela is out. I'll hang some ropes in your room so you can dry clothes there." Bradley left without listening to Mrs. Marks' arguments, presenting her with a fait accompli. Of course, the elderly woman didn't want to see her daughter-in-law too often. It would always result in a scandal. So she accepted her son's condition. She went to the kitchen to eat when no one was there. Now, sitting by the door, she waited patiently for Pamela to leave the kitchen. But Pamela, as if on purpose, had no intention of going anywhere. Mrs. Marks needed to take her medicine, which had to be taken after meals. She was already starting to shake, either from hunger or from skipping the pills. Finally she made up her mind, opened the door of her room, and went into the kitchen. Pamela was sitting at the table with one foot on her leg, lazily sipping coffee, stroking her belly, and watching a health programme. When she saw her mother-in-law, she grimaced. "You came?" Pamela snorted. "Couldn't you wait? We told you to stay in your room and keep your head down while I'm here." "Pamela, I'm starving, and it's time for my pills," said Mrs. Marks, as if justifying herself. "Pills?" Pamela grinned evilly. "Why the hell should you take them? Are you going to live 2 lives?" "Well, I'll live as long as God has given me," Mrs. Marks replied humbly, and remarked, "Pamela, you shouldn't drink coffee. At your stage of pregnancy, it's harmful." "Are you going to teach me how to live?" Pamela stormed out. "Take your food and go to your room, old fool. You've already been sent to the cemetery and you still can't get it. Taking pills to cure yourself? It's better for everyone if you die." These words made Mrs. Marks's hands shake and tears come to her eyes. She tried to brew herself a tea bag, but the cup slipped out of her trembling hands. Pamela shrieked in rage. She jumped up, grabbed Mrs. Marks by her frail shoulders, and pushed her back into the room. Then, while the elderly woman was sobbing on the sofa, Pamela burst in again. She put a plate and a mug in front of her mother-in-law, then left, slamming the door. There were pieces of bread, some of yesterday's stale porridge, and half a wilted cucumber. The mug contained water, apparently straight from the tap. Mrs. Marks, choking on her tears, took a piece of bread and, despite the offence and humiliation, began to chew. She was starving. As she ate, the elderly woman remembered her life and the events that led to what was happening in her house. Mrs. Marks came to this village many years ago on assignment after graduating from a pedagogical school. She taught geography and biology at the local school. At first, Margaret dreamed that after working the allotted time, she would return to her homeland. But then she met her love. Horace was a handsome guy. All the village beauties had their eyes on him, but he chose Margaret, a modest girl. Though she seemed unremarkable, Horace fell in love with her bottomless blue eyes and asked her to marry him. Margaret agreed, because by that time she herself thought only of Horace. They began their life together. Everything seemed fine, but they had no children. Mrs. Marks visited all the doctors, even travelling to the capital for this issue, but everywhere the answer was the same. She was healthy. Maybe her husband had a problem, but Horace refused to check his health, insisting he was fine. And how could he not be fine when he knew for certain that a woman from the neighbouring village had gotten pregnant with him? Yes, then she had gotten rid of the unwanted issue, but to Horace this was irrefutable proof of his virility. Margaret knew Horace was cheating on her. Even after the wedding, he continued his affairs. But she loved him very much, and he loved her in his own way. Every time, after his infidelities, he would repent to his wife on his knees. She always forgave him. But over the years, it became increasingly difficult to tolerate his unfaithfulness. When Mrs. Marks approached 40, she decided to divorce Horace. She planned to leave everything behind and return to her homeland, where her mother's house still stood. Upon hearing this, Horace fell to his knees as he used to, begging her not to leave. As Mrs. Marks listened to his pleas, she suddenly realized Horace didn't truly love her. He simply found it convenient to live with her. The house was always in order, meals were delicious, and her status as a local intellectual soothed his ego. Horace had spent his entire life as a simple tractor driver on the collective farm. Determined, Mrs. Marks packed her belongings and even went to the school to submit her resignation. However, in the principal's office, she suddenly fell ill and lost consciousness. She awoke in the hospital, with Horace sitting beside her, clutching her hand and biting his lips anxiously. Then the doctor entered the room. To their astonishment, Mrs. Marks was pregnant. It was like a bolt from the blue. She had long since given up hope of becoming a mother, and yet here it was. Naturally, all thoughts of divorce vanished, and she withdrew her resignation. Mrs. Marks and Horace reconciled, experiencing a second honeymoon after years of marriage. Horace changed dramatically. He became attentive, helpful and faithful. Despite a challenging pregnancy, Mrs. Marks safely gave birth to a daughter. Their joy knew no bounds as life took on new meaning. The family flourished. When Annabel was 3, Mrs. Marks became pregnant again. Village gossips joked that the teacher would give Horace a whole brood of children in his old age. However, after Mrs. Marks gave birth to a son, doctors strictly advised against further pregnancies due to her age and newly discovered heart problems. With a son and daughter, what more could they want? The family enjoyed 10 blissful years together. Horace doted on his wife, adored his children, and left his past behind. Mrs. Marks never mentioned it. Tragedy struck when Horace died in a tractor accident. He failed to notice a piece of iron protruding from the field road and overturned with the tractor. The machinery was barely damaged, but Horace didn't even make it to the hospital. Mrs. Marks found herself alone with 2 children. Times were tough, but she steeled herself, vowing to overcome all obstacles and raise her children to be upstanding individuals. She juggled her teaching job, took a part-time job at the local farm, all to keep her children fed. Annabel and Bradley helped their mother in any possible way, but when they finished school, each left for the city to pursue higher education. Mrs. Marks insisted on this, always emphasizing the importance of a college. Though it was challenging to support their education single-handedly, she managed. Annabel graduated with an economics degree, while Bradley completed a highway engineering program. Both children settled in the city. Annabel secured a position at a reputable firm and married a businessman, having 2 children of her own. Initially, she and her family visited Mrs. Marks in the village, but lately their busy lives have made visits scarce. Mrs. Marks understood and didn't take offence. Annabel and her husband run a demanding business. Of course, she wished she could see her grandchildren more often, but as city dwellers they showed little interest in village life. Bradley's life took an unexpected and not-so-good turn. After graduating from college, he bounced from one job to another, never quite finding his footing. After years of this nomadic career path, he headed north to build roads. There, he seemed to settle in and things were going well. The only thing that worried Mrs. Marks was his reluctance to marry. She chalked it up to genetics. He was, like his father, a wanderer. Horace had been lucky to meet Mrs. Marks, but fate hadn't been as kind to Bradley. But then a few years ago, Bradley announced his marriage to Pamela, who already had a child from a previous relationship. Mrs. Marks saw no issue with this. Bradley became both a husband and father at once, which she hoped would instill a sense of responsibility in him. Bradley seemed to take to his new role seriously, working hard and earning well. However, he soon returned to the state where his mother lived. It transpired that in the north he'd narrowly avoided criminal charges for fraud involving materials. Though the investigation cleared him from accused to witness, he could no longer work at his former job, prompting his return. For several years, Bradley lived in the city with Pamela and her daughter, Chloe. Life wasn't easy. Bradley struggled to find steady employment, and they had to rent an apartment. Then one day he approached his mother about moving his family in with her. He'd already secured a job at the local road department. Mrs. Marks, who had only met her daughter-in-law a couple of times and mostly communicated by phone, agreed. Her son had thought it through well. They would live together, with Pamela helping the aging mother-in-law with household chores, and Chloe, her teenage daughter, pitching in too. Plus, Pamela was expecting a baby. News that thrilled Mrs. Marks. While she had accepted Chloe, the prospect of Bradley having his own child felt particularly special. Soon her son's family moved in. Mrs. Marks welcomed them warmly, immediately encouraging Chloe to call her grandmother. The teenager merely curled her lips, saying nothing, but the elderly woman paid it no mind. She knew Chloe would need time to adjust. Bradley suggested his mother move into the small room, leaving the spacious one for Chloe and the bedroom for him and Pamela. Mrs. Marks agreed without fuss, content with the arrangement. One day Bradley arrived with some papers and a notary. He explained that Mrs. Marks needed to sign these documents so he could handle the utility bills, all the paperwork, and issues with authorities without her presence. Trusting her son implicitly, and recognizing the notary as Helen, her former student, the elderly woman signed without reading. Only later did she discover the true nature of what she had signed, a deed gifting the house to her son. The revelation came during an argument with Pamela over a poorly washed cup. "My dear," the elderly woman calmly responded, "you're living in my house. Show some respect." "Your house?" Pamela sneered. "It's our house now." "How can that be? I'm still alive. When I die, Bradley and Annabel will inherit everything." "I don't think so," the daughter-in-law shouted. "You signed a deed of gift to Bradley. What did you think the notary was for? You old fool." Now Mrs. Marks suddenly realized what kind of papers she had signed. Her son had deceived her, and this Helen, how much had they paid her? That day Mrs. Marks sat in her room, crying almost all day. When her son came home from work, she called him and asked directly if it was true about the notary in her house. "Mum, why are you worried?" Bradley replied irritably. "I just solved all the problems. It's better for everyone. Pamela and I have our own corner now. No one is kicking you out." "Son, you tricked me," exclaimed Mrs. Marks. "Don't dramatize it." Bradley waved her off. "I just made life easier for everyone. What would happen if you die and the house isn't registered? We'd have to deal with inheritance, pay for registration, and solve problems with Annabel. Why does she need this house? She has a great mansion in the city, and I have no corner. Everything's fair." "Son, but I'm still alive," Mrs. Marks said, barely audible and shocked. "So live. Who's stopping you?" Bradley muttered as he left the room. From that moment on, Mrs. Marks's life became a real torment. Pamela constantly nagged. Chloe treated her with contempt, as if she were invincible, and Bradley only relayed his wife's complaints to his mother. In her own house, Mrs. Marks was no longer the mistress, and was afraid to leave her room. Her conscience wouldn't allow her to complain to anyone, or make a fuss about her son's wrongdoing. Why air the family's dirty laundry? Why dishonour her son? She'd live out her life somehow. The neighbours, who used to visit Mrs. Marks often, stopped coming because Pamela had driven them all away. Sometimes they'd see Granny Margaret in the yard and ask about her life with her son's family, but the elderly woman would only avert her eyes. She'd say everything was fine and hurry home, fighting back tears and the lump in her throat. That morning, eating stale bread, Mrs. Marks decided to call her daughter. She called occasionally, but had never mentioned anything negative about her life. Now she decided to do it. She wanted Annabel to know how unfairly Bradley had acted and how poorly she was being treated. Annabel didn't pick up right away, and when she did, her voice was irritated. "Yes, Mum, what is it? Be quick. I'm heading to the tax office," she said abruptly.
"Daughter, I wanted to talk to you. I'm in trouble here,"
sobbed the elderly woman, quickly recounting all the troubles that had befallen her. Annabel listened silently for a moment, then burst into profanity about Bradley's deception. "Mother, you should have looked at what you were signing," she reproached.
Well, that's how it turned out, my daughter, her mother replied with a heavy sigh, then added with a tremor in her voice, Annabel, I was thinking, maybe you could take me in? I can't stay here any longer. I'm exhausted. You and Ben have a big house, so I'll just need a little room. I'll be as quiet as a mouse. It's better to live with my own daughter than with my daughter-in-law. I'll spend more time with my grandchildren, bake them pancakes and cakes.
Mum, what are you saying? Exclaimed Annabel indignantly. What are you thinking? I can't take you in. Ben and I have busy schedules, and we're used to resting when we're at home. And you're asking me to take care of you after work?
Who's there to take care of? I'm on my own feet, thank God, Mrs. Marks timidly remarked.
And what about later? Mother, you're almost 80. You need to think ahead, Annabel replied sharply. No, don't even ask. Live with Bradley. You're used to everything there. But here it's the city, with its own rules. And the grandchildren? They're quite grown up now. You don't need to look after them.
Why would they need your pies and pancakes?
They prefer pizza and rolls. Annabel ended the conversation abruptly, not listening to her mother any more. Mrs. Marks held the phone to her ear for a long time, listening to the short beeps. Her heart ached. Here she was in her old age. Her daughter didn't want her. Her son danced to his wife's tune, who hated her. Oh, how painful it was to realize that her own children had so easily forgotten all the good she had done for them. She had risked her life to bring them into this world, and this was their thanks to her. Nothing changed in the following days. Mrs. Marks tried to stay out of her daughter-in-law's sight, and when they ran into each other in the hallway, she was sure to hear Pamela hissing after her. "When will you die?" It was useless to complain to her son, so the elderly woman only cried in her room. Then one morning she heard Annabel's voice in the yard, arguing with her brother. The elderly mother thought Annabel would stand up for her now, maybe even take her in. Mrs. Marks, forgetting the hateful glances of her daughter-in-law, came out of her hiding place and hurried outside, but she froze halfway, hearing the conversation of her children. "You've taken over the house. You've become the owner of it. All right, to hell with it. I have no claim on this wreck anyway," Annabel said. "But you could think about our mother, couldn't you? If she bothers you, why didn't you turn to social services? Why do I have to solve all these problems from the city?" "I didn't think about it," Bradley mumbled. "She lives here and I don't mind at all." "Do you know that she asked to come to me? How can you imagine it? Am I to carry night pots from her?" Annabel exclaimed. "And you think I should?" Bradley raised his voice. "That's the last thing we need. Or is Pamela supposed to?" "Then why are you delaying? You should have taken her to the nursing home long ago. But as usual, I am the only one to solve these problems. Do you know how much money it cost me?" Annabel replied, and added more calmly, "Okay, stop talking useless. We have to pack her up. They said that she should be delivered by lunchtime. Go tell her." "Let's go together," Bradley said hesitantly. They stood in the yard, hesitating to enter the house. Mrs. Marks helped them and came out herself. "Bradley, Annabel," she said confusedly. "How can it be? What are you up to?" The son and daughter looked at each other, and Annabel, exhaling, raised her head. "Mum, don't worry so much. It's just that you're moving to the nursing home today. I've already arranged everything. It's that home in a neighbouring village." "Nursing home?" Mrs. Marks repeated in a trembling voice. "That's where they take all sorts of homeless people and ex-criminals and alcoholics whose children have abandoned them." "Mum, no one is abandoning you." Annabel raised her voice. "But understand, you can't go on like this.
I can't take you in. Bradley is already tired of your antics. How you make his pregnant wife nervous. A care home is the best option. And it's not true that only antisocial personalities live there. I found out. There are nice grandmothers, grandfathers. You'll find friends, and even a boyfriend. I don't need suitors, mumbled Mrs. Marks. I want to stay at home. This is my home. It's not yours any more, shouted Pamela from the living room, who had heard the whole conversation. Mrs. Marks only shrugged her shoulders at this remark and looked at her son and daughter in confusion. Children, what are you doing? I don't want to go to the care home. I can't. I will die there, she whispered in tears. Okay, Mum, enough, Bradley exclaimed, grabbed the elderly woman by the arm and pulled her into the house. How do you not realize that you are just interfering with our lives? You have lived your life. Let us live too. Let's go pack. He forced his mother into her room. Pamela immediately threw a large bag at her feet and began to throw the elderly woman's things into it chaotically. Bradley helped her. Mrs. Marks didn't even see what they threw in there. That's enough, said Bradley. If we forget something, we'll bring it back later. And he again grabbed the weeping mother by the hand, took her outside, and got her in Annabel's car. The daughter had been waiting patiently in the yard all this time. Let's go. They're already waiting for us, she said, starting the engine. Bradley, get in too. But Bradley shook his head and ran into the house. Annabel spat and drove off, trying not to look at the back seat where her mother was crying. 30 minutes later, the Wright settlement appeared. Here was the care home, a 2-story old grey building, dirty window frames cracked over time, thickets of maple all around, and in some places a leaky fence. All this only increased Mrs. Marks's pain and horror. Daughter, will I live here? She whispered fearfully. Why not? It's fine, Annabel answered cheerfully, turning off the engine. Nature, silence, peace, and the inside is much better than the outside. I've seen pictures of the rooms. Come on, let's go. On cotton legs, the elderly woman got out of the car and headed towards the building. She had already resigned herself to her fate. Her last years would be spent in this horrible place. Years? No, Mrs. Marks was sure that she wouldn't last even a few months here. She stepped to the threshold and froze in horror. At the door stood a large rusty bucket full of cigarette butts. God, what kind of people live here? From the depths of the building wafted something foul and musty. Mrs. Marks could barely hold back a fit of nausea. She looked helplessly at her daughter, her gaze pleading and despairing. But Annabel was calmly rummaging around in the trunk, pulling out the bag with her mother's belongings. The elderly woman, completely downcast, turned and stepped over the threshold. Suddenly, a black SUV flung up to the building, braked sharply, and the driver's door slammed. A man, paying no attention to Annabel, ran up to the porch. Mrs. Marks, don't go there, he shouted. The elderly woman, already standing in the vestibule, turned around in surprise. Squinting blindly, she tried to make out who the man was. A short, stout, middle-aged man, about Bradley's age, red-haired with whitish eyebrows. He reminded her of someone. Chet! Mrs. Marks gasped suddenly, recognizing her former pupil. It's me, Mrs. Marks, the man smiled. I've been following you all the way. I could hardly catch up with you. Why? The elderly woman looked at him confusedly. Because you won't live here, Chet said confidently. Mrs. Marks, since your children are abandoning you, I offer you my help. Will you live with me? You? Mrs. Marks blinked rapidly, crying, not knowing what to say. Chet. He had been the most problematic student in the school, and she was his class teacher. Chet often fought, studied poorly, and had almost no friends. Mrs. Marks knew the root of it all, his family. Chet's parents were heavy drinkers. Mrs. Marks, as a class teacher, often visited them, exhorted them, shamed them, tried to convince them to take care of their son's upbringing, but to no avail. They drank and parted away the pennies they earned from odd jobs. Chet always wore old clothes, unkempt, hungry, and angry. Mrs. Marks repeatedly appealed to the Department of Education, to Child Protective Services, to the Juvenile Department, to somehow influence Chet's parents. But in those years, everyone seemed indifferent to this family's plight. Mrs. Marks felt sorry for the boy, so she gave him Bradley's clothes. Her son was a year older. By the way, Bradley and Annabel, as well as the other children, didn't understand her, even condemned her. Why did she bother with the son of an alcoholic? Nevertheless, Mrs. Marks gave Chet some money for school lunches and took him to the local hairdresser. Perhaps she was the only one who saw in this boy not a hellion, but just an unhappy child who, like a hedgehog, defended himself from the whole world. At first, Chet was embarrassed to accept her help, but Mrs. Marks convinced him that it was the right thing to do, and he believed her. Geography even became his favourite subject at school. By graduation time, the boy had somehow calmed down, even passing his exams without a single C. Then his parents poisoned themselves with some toxic stuff and died. Mrs. Marks personally accompanied him to the orphanage and admonished him not to lose his way, to hold on, to behave with dignity. She also promised to visit him at the orphanage. Mrs. Marks fulfilled her promise. Until Chet graduated from the orphanage, she visited him monthly, bringing treats. She even saw him off to the army, giving him money despite his reluctance. "You must take," she insisted. After that, they lost touch. Chet wrote twice, then silence. Mrs. Marks tried to find out what happened, but to no avail. It seemed as if Chet had vanished into a conflict zone. Time passed, and she forgot her former student, until they unexpectedly met at the threshold of a nursing home. "Don't go in there," Chet pleaded. "What do you mean, don't go in there?" Annabel snapped, lugging the bag. She recognized Chet, too. "Chet, you should leave. We'll manage without you." "Annabel, you go," Chet replied calmly. "Mrs. Marks and I will figure this out." "Mother, why are you listening to that thug?" Annabel exclaimed. "Can't you see he's after something? He probably thinks you have a huge pension." "Well, Chet, her pension is miserable. It won't be profitable for you. Now get lost." "Annabel, not everything is about money," Chet responded, still gentle. "I won't let Mrs. Marks end up in a nursing home. If her own children aren't ashamed, my conscience won't allow it. Mrs. Marks, let's go to my car. Don't worry, you'll be fine at my place. I have a nice house and family. We'll take good care of you." Mrs. Marks took a step towards him. "Mum, wake up!" Annabel shouted. "Who are you going to live with? You don't even know him." "Daughter, it turned out that I don't know you and Bradley either," the elderly woman replied weakly. "Fine, do what you want," Annabel yelled, throwing her bag at her feet before storming off to her car. "But don't call me again or complain. I'm done taking care of you." "Yeah, we don't need that kind of care," Chet retorted, picking up the bag. "Mrs. Marks, let's go." The elderly woman followed Chet to his car as Annabel sped away, leaving a cloud of dust. From the nursing home windows, residents watched the pair, some curious, some envious. On the drive, Chet shared his story. He had served in the army, was in a hot spot and survived. After returning, he briefly fell in with a bad crowd, but managed to escape. He found his footing, working hard at various jobs, and eventually met Nancy, also from an orphanage. Gradually their lives improved. Now Chet owned a successful auto business, a nice big house. His wife Nancy had given birth to 3 children and ran her own bakery. Recently, Chet felt compelled to visit his parents' graves. Though they had been miserable, they had given him life. He also wanted to see Mrs. Marks, the only person who had believed in him as a child, supported him, and offered wise counsel. Perhaps that's why he had found the right path. He arrived in the village just after Annabel had taken Mrs. Marks away. Neighbours told him what they'd overheard Annabel and Bradley say to their mother. Chet felt deeply hurt for Mrs. Marks. He rushed to the nursing home, calling Nancy en route to explain everything. She suggested taking in Mrs. Marks, amazing Chet with how well she understood his thoughts. "Nancy, I'm sure we're doing the right thing," he said. "Of course we are. We'll have a mother, and our children will have a grandmother. It's wonderful," she replied with a smile. And so Chet drove back to the city with his favourite teacher, now his dearest person. As time passed, neither Chet, Nancy, nor Mrs. Marks regretted their decision. For the first time in years, the old woman felt warmth and care, which she reciprocated abundantly with her new family. As for Annabel and Bradley, they never called to check on their mother. They remained indifferent. Annabel was divorcing her husband and dividing their property. Bradley, jobless again, stayed home with his newborn son, while his wife gallivanted about. Everyone got what they deserved.